Learning is really great, isn't it? Learning is fun. No, it isn't. Learning is really difficult. Welcome to The Learning Hack, a podcast about the people and technologies that are creating the future of learning. I'm John Helmer.
Now guess what? Learning is cool. Learning is cool. Learning is cool.
A while ago, I was in one of those online conference sessions where people chit-chat away on the chat and ignore the speaker, and people were talking about the topic of difficulty in learning. Of course, we have to make learning fun and engaging for people, otherwise they wouldn't do it. But how do we get past the undoubted fact, proven time and again by research, that there is an inherent difficulty in learning something new? My guest this time on The Learning Hack was in that chat, and she's someone I thought was eminently qualified to take this knotty subject on. Kate Fitzgerald, Head of Fact. Who is she?
Hack facts.
Stella Collins is co-founder and chief learning officer of Stella Labs based in Belgium. With degrees in psychology and human communication, she is an enthusiast for our growing knowledge of how the brain works. Curiosity about how people think, work and learn, she says, has led her to investigate how psychology and neuroscience applied to training drive personal and organisational change.
Stella's also one of the Brain Ladies, a collective of people passionate about applying brain science. And what I'm really curious about is this question of difficulty in learning and what a brain lady like Stella can tell us about it. So, Jay Curtis, head of themes in your dark little cave, did we hit that particular nail on the head?
Yes, you did, John, and you drove it pretty deep into that plank of wood or whatever. But Stella was too interesting a guest to stick to just one theme, even if that theme is your personal hobby horse. She also had interesting things to say about the different roles played by psychology and neuroscience, and reflections on Miriam Neelan's comments about neuroscience in the last episode, as well as a surprisingly fascinating take on the importance of sleep.
Stella is one learning specialist who definitely won't put you to sleep. It was a learning experience for me talking to her, an engaging and approachable guest who nevertheless made my brain work pretty hard. Welcome to The Learning Hack, Stella Collins.
Hello, it's lovely to be here, John.
Learning is difficult, so much so that we avoid doing it. Nobody wants to be a learner driver for 1 minute longer than is absolutely necessary, for instance. So what insights from psychology can you point to that can help us make things easier for learners?
It's quite interesting that you say it's difficult. And I think it's kind of, what do we mean by difficult? It's not so much difficult as kind of hard work and good work. Because when we're learning, we're making lots of new connections, we're creating new habits, we're having to test out new things, new experiences. We're trying to move memories from short to long-term memory. We're trying to make things that were, conscious into unconscious. So it's kind of, it's effortful, I think is the word that I prefer to difficult.
Okay.
But I think one of the things that does happen is we sometimes learning becomes difficult for us because we're not supported to learn well. So an example is I was talking to a student last week who she was studying for psychology. So we had loads in common. We were really interested in what we were talking about. She's been studying for psychology, and her view of studying that she's been kind of taught by the university is you sit and you read and you make some notes, and then you might do the odd, test paper, and that's about it. And then you read and you read again, and you read stuff that's not very well presented in the first place, technical papers, not always very well written. And that was her view of how you did learning. And it really wasn't learning at all. It was really reading and not doing much more. So that kind of, that makes learning more difficult because you're not actually doing the learning. You're not actually doing anything with it. You're not performing with that knowledge. If that makes sense.
Yeah, but I think it's slightly different there in that it doesn't feel difficult to sit and read a book, but it's more difficult to learn that way. You see the distinction I'm getting at there?
Yes, it is. So it feels easier, doesn't it, to just sit and read a book and you think, yeah, that I've probably learned that. And then you can look at the book again and then you recognize it. But actually you haven't learned it, because if you were then asked to recall that information, you wouldn't probably be able to remember it, and you probably also wouldn't be able to do anything with it.
Yeah. So there's things we can do to make learning more effective and make it less difficult to learn in that sense. But are there other things that we can do to help learners who are encountering a kind of amount of difficulty with the sheer process of learning that they switch off?
So helping them find their motivation is probably one of the first things in learning, because if people aren't motivated, they can sit and read all they want. They can do any exercises they want. But if they're not motivated to want to use that knowledge or to learn a new skill, then they're not going to put in the effort that they need in order to learn it effectively.
So motivation's a funny thing, isn't it? What does psychology teach us about that? How we can get people more motivated to learn?
I think one of the key things with motivation is you can't actually motivate somebody else. They've got to do it for themselves. But there are things we can do to help them feel their own motivation and find their own motivation. So, asking them about what they want to get out of this learning. What's the purpose of it? What's the outcome that they're looking for? What do they expect to achieve by it? Getting them to think about, why they're learning for their long-term goals can be really valuable. But also engaging them in the learning, making the learning interactive, making it enjoyable for a start. I don't like to use the word fun too much, because some people don't like the word fun, but making it enjoyable, making it sensory, making it concrete rather than abstract. All those things can help drive motivation. Setting small goals and allowing people to celebrate when they achieve small goals, knowing they're going to achieve whatever the bigger picture, the bigger goal they're looking for.
So you can kind of harness people's motivation to a sense of purpose in what it's going to do for them. How do you work that when it's really the ultimate beneficiary is the company you're working for? Say, I'm thinking about compliance learning now. The great thing about you doing this compliance program is that the company won't get sued, and the CEO won't lose his job. That doesn't feel like the most kind of powerful intrinsic motivator.
So I think one of the challenges of compliance training is we're not finding people's motivation, and there's always a motivation for it, because for all of us, compliance training keeps us safe. Yes, the CEO might get prosecuted, but actually, if the CEO gets prosecuted, you're also going to find it difficult too. But more importantly, compliance is there to keep people safe or to make their working lives better. And I think often we teach compliance training as here's the rules you must follow, but we don't often teach the why. We don't teach them why, health and safety training is actually really important. We don't teach them why financial regulation is important. We just teach them the rules that they must learn. So I think it's still getting down to that why. What's in it for me?
Yeah, it's probably a bit easier with health and safety training. People can see that, well, if you lift things in the right way, you're not going to mess your back up. Starts to get a bit more kind of distant in when you're sort of looking at maybe data protection, financial compliance, that kind of stuff.
There's lots of stories around about why we need those things. So I think it's about tapping into people's personal stories, sharing stories with them about, people who've had their data abused. So they've actually got a real purpose for understanding. And so bring in the emotional context, because all these things have an emotional resonance to them. So I think, stories are really powerful there in terms of helping people understand why we need to be data compliant.
But there's an apparent contradiction, isn't there, when we look at difficulty in learning? Because on the one hand, you want to make it easy for people to get motivated to do learning, easy to do it. But we read in Bjork and Bjork, that's the husband and wife learning psychology duo, not the Icelandic recording artist, about necessary difficulties being essential for learning to take place.
I think it's not that there just have to be difficulties. They're the right sort of difficulties that help learning take place. So it's not just making, information inaccessible or making it feel very boring as you go through this e-learning package. The necessary difficulties, they're actually called desirable difficulties. So they are actually, you do want these difficulties. And those are things like making sure that people practice in varied circumstances so that they can then adapt, whatever they learn, they can adapt it to different circumstances later on. So that's more difficult to learn in varied circumstances. If you were learning to, I don't know, shoot a basketball or something, and the height of the basketball net kept changing, that would feel more difficult than just having one place to aim for. But actually that would improve your basketball net shooting, if that's a technical term.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting, because surely if you're a pro basketball player, you'd expect the hoop always to be at exactly a regulation height, don't you? But you're saying that although the kind of area of performance where you will practice your skill might be very similar, very regulated. Every time you're a snooker player, every time you go to a snooker hall, the snooker table will be of the same dimensions and so on. But it will actually improve you in learning the skill if you perhaps practice on all different sizes of table and different heights of hoop and so on. Is that the case?
And if you think about the hoop, yes, the hoop is always in one place, but you're not. You come at the hoop from lots of different angles. So if you can shoot a hoop wherever it is, that it doesn't matter whether you're, the end of the court, or perhaps you're having to do a very low shot or a very high shot. If you've got more variety in your practice, then that will help you be better at the changes that are going to be there, that naturally are there.
So that's sports. How would we relate that? Could you give me an example from something from, say, I don't know, from the organizational learning world, like soft skills? I don't know.
So for example, if you were teaching assertiveness skills, and you gave people some exercises in dealing with, in being more assertive in a meeting, if you only give them the practice in a meeting, they may never transfer that kind of experience into other situations, because meetings are quite structured. So they might not transfer that learning into, a casual conversation or a conversation with a senior person in a non-structured environment. So again, giving them practice in different contexts helps to make that learning kind of broader. Yeah.
So in working with and designing for learners, how do you balance this need to make things slightly difficult with the need to make things easy as possible for them to actually access and want to do the learning? Is there ever a conflict there, or are they two kind of different things? Could we say UX and how you get to the learning, that should all be very simple. Actually, when you're there, we will look for the places to do the necessary difficulties, the slightly disorientating thing of having the hoop at different heights and all that type of difficulty. Are they in two completely different places, those things? Or is there occasionally a kind of trade-off?
That's a really interesting question as to whether it's a trade-off. But I think if you design and deliver using an evidence base, you look at what is the evidence around what makes learning effective, then they're actually the same things. Because, if we talk about desirable difficulties, there's evidence to show that some level of desirable difficulty is helpful. But what you don't want to do is have undesirable difficulties. For instance, one of my kind of passions is how text is presented to people, because, people often have to read, but often text is presented in a way that just puts some barriers in front of reading. So I had one this morning. I was talking to a colleague, and they'd written something for a website in italics. Now, it's actually harder for our brains to process italics and written language in italics than it is plain text. It's harder for our brains to process language if it's written, if it's centrally justified rather than left justified. Now, most of us don't really recognize that because we're used to seeing it. But if you've got anyone with any language difficulty at all, so, a form of dyslexia, for instance, they really notice that, this is much harder to read when text is centrally justified. A colleague of mine recently called it, the people with dyslexia, for instance, are like the canaries in the mine.
Yeah.
They can flag really quickly that there's something wrong here. But that challenge is also, we're all experiencing that challenge. So we're all giving ourselves kind of unnecessary cognitive overload, or we're receiving unnecessary cognitive overload by some of those barriers that get put up.
Yeah, that's interesting, because when you're talking particularly about type, typography is kind of a subset of graphic design, and one that less people seem to know about nowadays, is there's so much kind of screen design. But I mean, that example, particularly italics, are cognitively more difficult to process, you're saying, and that's why we use them for emphasis, I suppose, is that it will kind of stop you in the sentence, in a sense, to look at the italicized
But it's actually
work.
much more effective to use bold for emphasis than italics.
Oh, okay.
Because the bold stands out and you can see it, but your brain doesn't have to work quite so hard to interpret it.
So it would be more, if you're using bold, it's that thing of, here's a load of very similar looking words. Oh, this one looks different. Which one? What's that? Oh, it's because it's bolder, it stands out.
Yeah.
Because of kind of similarity and difference.
Yeah.
But it's interesting that there's a kind of, learning design is a kind of mixture of science and art. But within the art, there is underlying science. Typographers do that stuff for a reason. And it's to do with cognitive psychology.
So I mean, typographers, so designers often put things in centrally justified, because just at a glance, it looks nicer. It looks neat. It's not got raggedy edges. But actually, that's not supporting the learning. It's not supporting the reading process. Yeah. Obviously, we learn in different ways than just reading, but, that's an example. It's not supporting the reading process, but it looks nice. So they'll often argue, yes, but it looks nicer. And I will always argue back, but the purpose of, if you've written something, it's not just for it to look nice, it's that somebody actually can read it and extract the information and hopefully do something with it.
Moving to your background, you have degrees in both psychology and human communication. Can you tell us what drew you to learning as a field in which to make a career? And can you outline your career in that field to date? I
can. I was originally absolutely never going to get into learning. Most of my family were teachers, and the kind of experience they had of coming home and saying, I'm absolutely exhausted and the kids have been terrible. And they kind of loved teaching, but it looked to me like it was really hard work. And as a young person, I was absolutely terrified of standing in front of a crowd of people. So I had no intention of getting into learning at all, but I really loved psychology. I really was curious about people and how they worked and how they operated, which was why I did the degrees. And then I actually went into IT, and I found a job in IT because there were a lot of jobs in IT in the 1980s. And I really enjoyed that. So I was a programmer and I was an analyst, and I became a support manager. But I kind of accidentally got given this hat of IT support and training manager. And I really didn't want the training manager's hat at all. It was just, I don't want to do training. I'd experienced lots of training as an IT person. That was terrible. It was really bad training. You'd go on a 2-week, 3-week long training course, and you'd come back and then think, right, now I'm going to have to actually learn what I was supposed to learn on that course, because there was no real practical. It was just lots of theory, lots of PowerPoint, and no interaction. The learners didn't get to do much. So I had no intention of getting into training, got this training hat and really didn't want it, and employed somebody as a trainer who was hugely inspirational. And she had sort of really different and innovative ways of designing and delivering IT training. And I thought, oh, actually, this is really interesting. And then we got kind of into the psychology of learning. So I kind of fell into it by mistake. And since then, I fell into it by mistake. I worked in this company as the training manager, and then decided I wanted to set up on my own. And I was so fascinated. I've always been fascinated by the brain and how that works. And I wasn't seeing that being used in the training that I had experienced. So I was really keen that we started to use what we know about the brain, what we know about learning from psychology, to actually infuse that into learning design, but also into the content that we were delivering, because I think people really like to understand themselves. And if you can explain a little bit about their brains to them, for most people, it's a real revelation and they really enjoy that and they kind of really engage with it. So I wanted to sort of design with the brain in mind, but also introduce elements of people's brains to themselves.
You are data.
You are data. You are data. You are data.
Every pulse of your heart, every step you take, the place you travel to, the thing that gets your attention, it all leaves a trace in data. And the world reconfigures itself around you, moment to moment, based on that data.
You are data. You are data.
Data has learned a lot about you over the years. Isn't it time you learned more about data?
You are data. You are data. You are data. You are data.
Data is a hot topic in learning right now, perhaps the hottest. But when you look at what's happened historically with learning analytics, it's hard to deny that it's been a little bit stuck. Stuck in the first two levels of Kirkpatrick. Stuck in what David Wilson and Charles Jennings have called the conspiracy of convenience. Stuck in a lack of capability, money, and time to evaluate. So how can we get ourselves out of this endless Mobius loop of wanting to do it all, but ending up not actually doing very much? I've talked to a lot of experts and practitioners, and the result is a whole series of guides and resources that Learning Pool will be releasing to help you map your way out of that loop. Download the first of these now. The Data and Learning White Paper.
You are data. You are data. You are data. You are data.
I'm really pleased that this episode is supported by NIIT, the global learning outsourcing company that helps organisations run training like a business. NIIT is dedicated to helping customers increase the business value of L&D. So whether it's reduced costs, increased flexibility and business alignment, technology innovation, or a dramatic improvement in learner experience you're after, you can trust NIIT to deliver measurable and transformative business impact. To learn more, visit niit.com. So at what point in that career did the psychology begin to feel intensely relevant to what you were doing? Was it kind of from day one?
Yes, it was always relevant. I mean, I'd kept, even though I was working in IT, I kept studying psychology. I kept reading it. I would watch any TV program that was about it. I read lots of books. So I was, my psychology was still relatively up to date. So when I moved into learning, it was just natural to use that as part of what I did. So I ran my own business for 20 years and then rather beautifully met a client who was wanting to, he had a business that they were training a lot of young people, but he wasn't sure that he was getting a return on investment and was really keen to find a better way of learning. So I worked as a client for him. And then we decided we would actually start a business together.
Stella Labs.
Stella Labs, yes.
And you also do LinkedIn learning training.
I do, yes. I put a program together for LinkedIn learning on how to use neuroscience at a very high level, how to use the psychology and science of learning in design. But we've only done one because at the time when we were starting it, you had to fly over to Santa Barbara, which was really lovely to film. Oh, wow. That was lovely. But then, of course, Corona hits. So we haven't done any more. But I have now found out there's a European LinkedIn learning person who's organising that we can do filming in Europe too. So hopefully we'll be doing more of that.
Yeah. Not sexy as jetting off to the west coast of America to do some filming.
Not quite as sexy, but a lot better in terms of time management.
Absolutely, yeah. I think we've all found that over the last year or so that, no little excuses for travel, which was so nice, but which took up so much time and actually get more done.
Yeah. Yes, I don't quite know how we're going to manage when we actually go back to having to go into the office and spend time commuting instead of just working.
There's been a lot of interest in neuroscience in learning circles over the past decade or so, and a good deal of neurobabble has got along with that, unfortunately. Recently, we had Miriam Nealon on the podcast, and while she wasn't completely dissing neuroscience, she did seem to feel that what we can actually get from the field in terms of guidance for learning as a practice area was pretty limited, in fact. To what extent would you agree or disagree with that as a brain lady?
Miriam and I have this conversation quite regularly, actually. And I know she loves neuroscience. She's utterly fascinated by herself. I start off by defining neuroscience quite broadly. So, some people define it as very much the biology, the physiology of your brain and how it works. Mm-hmm. But actually, I take the broader view of neuroscience. So it's, the psychology, the biology, the artificial intelligence, everything we can find out about the science of learning, because that's where learning happens in our brains. So to me, it's all neuroscience. The very specific pieces of neuroscience that are, if we think about the biology of learning, I agree with her in some ways. It's not always very applicable to, a real world learning and development team, or to a designer of learning. Because neuroscience experiments are done usually on small groups. They're done in very unrealistic situations. They're often done on animals. So, it doesn't necessarily apply to us. But I do think there is things coming out of neuroscience now that are really helping to provide evidence for some of the theories and practices that people have had. So I think it provides supporting evidence. And I also think it is, there is some neuroscience that's beginning to have an impact. And some of that is around the connection between brain and body, for instance. So, this idea that we have a very strong sort of sub-brain in our guts, and how that connects, and how that means we actually need, a healthy gut in order to have a healthy brain and a healthy mind. So I think there's some really interesting connections between the whole body and brain in terms of what neuroscience can tell us. And then there's some really interesting things, like a piece that I came across recently I thought was really interesting, was that fear and curiosity are actually both felt very much in the same part of the brain. So there's a piece of your brain called the nucleus accumbens. And if there's a strong dopamine stimulation at the back of the brain, at the back of the nucleus accumbens, you get a feeling of fear. And if there's a strong dopamine release at the front, you get a feeling of curiosity. Now, you can't say to somebody, I want you to be more curious, just stimulate the front of your nucleus accumbens. Of course you can't. But I think beginning to understand that fear and curiosity clearly are linked because they are in the same parts of your brain begins to give us insights into how can we help people, reduce fear, which is bad for learning, unless you're learning to run away from an elephant, but actually to increase curiosity, which is really powerful and useful for learning. So I think there are pieces of neuroscience that are beginning to inform thinking. And I think the other thing is, if we don't start looking at neuroscience and what it can tell us, if we don't start looking at it now, well, it may still be quite, well, it's not that it's theoretical, it's very practical, but it may not be completely relevant to what we're doing if we're trying to design a compliance training course. But if we don't start investigating it, if we just throw it out, we're losing a whole pile of information and knowledge that can inform what we do and can change what we do. So that's my response.
Well, it's a fascinating response. And there's a couple of things to pick up on that. One is the division between psychology and neuroscience. It's interesting, I've been doing a webinar with people at BAD Digital, and with two people, one of whom is a psychologist, cognitive psychologist, and the other one is a neuroscience. So my first question to them was, how do you divide it up between you? And the answer was, she does the grey squishy stuff.
Yeah.
And that the psychology is more about the mind than the brain. But it's interesting that you are kind of going across those two in a sense.
And I think for me, that's because I did a science-based psychology degree. So we did a lot of the brain squishy stuff. So for me, psychology, the brain squishy stuff and the mind are completely connected in, obviously a theoretical way, a abstract way, but they are connected. And cognitive psychology itself is, people sometimes talk about, well, what we know from cognitive psychology is really relevant to learning. But actually, if you think of a lot of cognitive psychology experiments, they're not at all like what happens learning in the real world. They're again, they're very focused on a very specific context. They're, asking people to do exercises that you would never do in real life. So there's this kind of thing that, neuroscience is very separated from our real lives, whereas cognitive psychology is about real life. But actually, cognitive psychology, a lot of those experiments are not concrete, not real, not relevant to, they are relevant, but they're not kind of really directly connectable to what we're doing in a learning and development team in an organization, for instance.
And perhaps that's where some of the dangers that Miriam talks about come from, is that you will have people very confidently saying in a kind of, neurobabble keynote, something that when you actually look at the original paper that's based on, there is a paper that had these findings. When you look at it, it's in such a different context that really you realize that it's...
And I think one of the things we need to do is get L&D, but, personally, I think if everybody had a kind of a scientific mindset, that would be a really valuable thing to do, because you get a piece of evidence and you think about, is this piece of evidence relevant for this thing that I'm doing now? And you come up with a hypothesis, and you then find the evidence to support your hypothesis, or just as beautifully disproves your hypothesis. And that, a scientific mindset is just as happy to have a hypothesis disproved as it is to have it proved. Whereas in a less scientific context, we're always looking to, to validate our theories. I heard the person he was a chief scientist at CERN, and he was, when they were just about to discover the Higgs boson, and they hadn't quite decided whether it was there or not yet, and he was being interviewed. And the interviewer said, so what happens, if it's going to be a disaster, isn't it, if you find it doesn't exist? And this guy was like, oh, no, that's really, really exciting, because that just proves that doesn't exist. And that just opens up a whole new area of exploration for us. So I think that feeling of, yes, you've got to find evidence, but you also, if the evidence shows it's not true, then you have to believe that evidence too.
A null result is good data as well.
Yeah.
The other point that came out of your earlier response I wanted to pursue was the question of applicability, particularly with neuroscience, which seems quite difficult. Certainly some things, like the link between fear and curiosity that you mentioned, are, it's kind of provokes thought, that, doesn't it? It's something to think about. How that would actually lead into practice is difficult. And other things like the potential existence of another brain in the gut, which is kind of in a knowledge we have, which is embedded in metaphors such as gut feeling and so on, is an interesting one. But I mean, how would you apply that? I mean, if someone turned up for a session and they say, "I'm finding this learning really difficult," you say, "Well, what did you have for breakfast? Are you
absolutely yes, John? Absolutely, that is exactly. We our bodies and our brains are completely interlinked, and if we didn't have a good breakfast, or we, are feeling ill, we can't learn as well as if we're really, really fit and healthy. Exercise has been shown consistently to improve learning.
Yeah.
So it's that link between our brains and bodies that is so hugely important. And if we're designing learning, we need to take into account that if somebody comes along and they haven't had a breakfast, then they're not going to learn as effectively. So when we were running proper face-to-face courses in the past, we would always have snacks, healthy snacks and things available for people so that they could feed their brains. Your brain uses so much energy, it needs feeding.
Yeah, but maybe not bowls of opal fruits, which I remember from Jane's.
No, we didn't use bowls of opal fruits. No, we used healthy things that, slow digest, healthy release. But sometimes if you're really working hard, you need a quick glucose fix because you need your brain to have enough energy to take on new information.
Yeah. I'm interested in how that would work out in, say, a leadership context, and top management coaching and stuff like that, you know, you want to make sure you're eating right. Do you want to be the trainer who has to tell Donald Trump to lay off the cheeseburgers?
If he wants to learn, it's going to be best for him. But, you know, I suspect you're not going to have an argument with him, because you'll never win it, because he's so convinced of his own ideas. But if you were genuinely, if I was coaching somebody, I mean, often I'll do coaching, you know, outside, or coaching walking, or, you know, making sure that people are physically and emotionally and psychologically comfortable before you go into a coaching conversation. It's not good enough just to have a theoretical conversation.
Yeah. I think it's interesting the way that this takes the kind of role of the L&D, the learning professional, slightly out of, you know, out of the box, as it were, in a way that might make people rather difficult to understand it. You know, what do you do in the learning department there? Well, you know, we make people go out for a walk and chat and so on. But it's a kind of wider focus on wellness and so on. I can see why so many L&D people are interested in wellness as a topic, including Josh Burson. Interesting.
If we're not well, our brains can't work as well, and then we can't learn as well.
Yeah.
Well, our brains and bodies.
Yeah.
You know, if you're learning physical skills, you need your body to be able to do whatever the physical skill is as well.
So another question which I initially thought was going to seem pretty random, but actually now flows on completely from this discussion, is about sleep. I mean, one thing I've heard from loads of people is that one thing everyone agrees about when it comes to kind of learning theory is that sleep is essential to learning. I don't really want to turn this interview into a succession of me saying, oh, I read this interesting thing and I don't understand it. Can you explain, brain lady? But this particular one, it can't possibly be as simple as it sounds, surely, because everybody sleeps. So there's no real effect on your learning practice, because it's going to happen anyway, isn't it? Or have I not been paying proper attention?
When I researched the chapter on sleep for my book, that was probably the hardest piece of research I've ever done in terms of, you know, reading and things, because it's so complex. Sleep is just crazy complicated. Having said that, yes, everybody sleeps, but not everybody sleeps the same. They don't sleep the same amount of time. They don't have the same balance of sleep. Some people sleep very badly. Some people sleep very well. And sleep is incredibly important for learning. And it's there's all sorts of reasons, but there's two kind of key areas where it's vitally important. One is when you go so you have different stages of sleep. And one of these areas where it's really important is deep sleep, is where we actually consolidate. And this is where I think neuroscience can help us, is where you consolidate long-term memories. So as you're learning in the day, as you're taking in information, you know, whether you're consciously learning, to pass an exam, or you're just learning that, you know, the sky is blue, whatever it might be. As you're learning during the day, information is passing into your brain. And most of it gets funneled into the hippocampus during the day. And the hippocampus acts as a kind of storage area, but only a temporary storage area, holding area. At night, when you go into deep sleep, what happens is that information is then fed back, mostly into the areas, the sensory areas it came from. So, you know, light comes into your eyes, it goes via your optic nerve to your cortex, the visual cortex anyway, goes to the visual cortex, and then and some of that information gets sent off to the hippocampus. At night, what happens is that information goes out of the hippocampus and gets stored in the visual cortex. If you disrupt that sleep and don't let people sleep, that storage, that long-term consolidation doesn't happen. So you literally can't remember. If you miss a night's sleep, you really can't remember what you learned the day before. And if you miss 2 nights sleep, I mean, they've done studies, and it's amazing how much you can't remember. And memory is obviously a strong part of learning. So long-term memory consolidation, hugely important. And the other piece where sleep is really interesting is it seems to be very useful for practicing motor skills. Right. So, you know, learning to play that basketball game. When we go into dream sleep, our brains are as active as if we're awake. So our bodies are completely paralyzed. There's a particular neurotransmitter that gets sent around our bodies and says, don't move while you're dreaming. But your brain is performing all the motor activities that it would do if you were really moving. So you're physically practicing things, or your brain is doing it whilst you're sleeping. So there was some evidence, it was people learning to ski on a ski simulator. Mm-hmm. And they found that those people who learned in the evening and shortly afterwards went to bed had a greater improvement in their skiing than people who either learned in the morning and other things had displaced that information during the day, or if they disrupted their sleep so they didn't get any dream sleep, they didn't have the same performance increment.
Well, that's a great example of a very interesting answer coming from a very dumb question.
It wasn't a dumb question. There's no such thing.
Yeah. Oh, well, yeah. It just goes to show. I thought when I was typing that one, I thought this is a dumb question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. So
no, it's sleep is
always
amazingly
worth asking.
important.
Yeah.
And there's still so much to find out about sleep.
Yeah. But the moral there is sleep after the training session, not during.
Yes. Oh, yes. You cannot learn whilst you're sleeping. So you can't have new information go in while you're sleeping because your sensory cortices are all shut down. What happens is the consolidation. So yeah, don't go to sleep listening to stuff. You won't remember it.
So finally, could I just ask, what are you really fascinated? I mean, you've had this lifelong interest in psychology and obviously a fascination with it. What is really interesting you at the moment, and where can people go to find out, to follow your thought about this? They need to. So
they can follow me on Twitter at Stella Collins. They can find me on LinkedIn, or if they go to stellalabs.eu, they can find lots of the resources that we create and share. What am I really fascinated? I'm actually really, and this sounds a bit boring now, I'm actually getting quite interested in the data. So where we are at Stella Labs, we're beginning to look at how data supports learning and how we can use data as feedback for learners as they're going through the process. So we can use through the learning process to help them with their learning journey. So not just kind of, summative assessment at the end, you've learned all this stuff, have you passed the test? But by regularly testing and getting the data on how well you've done, that can actually help to improve the learning journey and improve the long-term learning. So that's kind of my current new fascination that I know so little about, and I am finding out as we go along. So that's where I am at the moment. How can data support us in our learning?
And I think there's lots that you've shown us today that would be very interesting for people, and they will have learned something. Stella Collins, thank you very much.
Thank you.
That's all on the Learning Hack podcast for this time. Many thanks to Stella and to our sponsors Learning Pool and NIIT. The Learning Hack is completely independent and transparently funded by sponsorship. Please subscribe on your podcast platform of choice or on YouTube.
You can tweet me at John Helmer or reach me through my website, johnhelmerconsulting.com.
Coming up on the Learning Hack.
Next time, tune in for a vaccination special. We're lucky enough to have two guests who are each in their own way doing vital work to help us defeat the pandemic. Mark Howells, Global Head of Talent at AstraZeneca, and Rada Sadki of the Geneva Learning Foundation. Don't miss it. Smash that subscribe button now.
Stay safe, learning people.
Now I finally get it.
Well, you made me work really hard there.
Sorry.
You give such good, short, focused answers that we would have got through my questions in 10 minutes if I hadn't had follow-up questions.
Please subscribe on your podcast. Your podcast.